Hi guys, welcome to Nutshell. Today we're going to recap the highest IMDb rated movie called SHAWSHANK Redemption. Spoilers ahead. The year is 1947. A young Portland banker, Andy Dufresne, is convicted of the murder of his wife Linda Dufresne and her lover Glenn. Andy is adamant in defending his innocence, but the evidence is overwhelming where he is sentenced to 2 life sentences and sent to the notoriously harsh Shawshank prison. Meanwhile, Ellis Redding, better known as Red, is being interviewed for parole after having spent 20 years at Shawshank for murder. Despite his best efforts and behavior, Red's parole is rejected, which doesn't really faze him all that much. Red is known as the man who knows how to get things and can get almost anything a prisoner could want from the outside world. An alarm goes off alerting all prisoners of new arrivals, out of which Andy Dufresne is one of them. During the first night, an overweight newly arrived inmate, nicknamed as Fat Ass, breaks down and cries hysterically. The chief guard, Byron Hadley, savagely beats the fat man for not keeping quiet when he's asked to. The next morning, the inmates learn that Fat Ass died in the infirmary because the prison doctor had been out for the night. This makes Andy really sad and terrified. About a month later, Andy approaches Red, having heard of his talents for finding things, and asks Red to find him a rock hammer, an instrument he claims is necessary for his hobby of rock collecting and sculpting. Red asks a few questions about his intentions, which Andy just laughs off. Red agrees to place the order and also warns Andy about the Sisters, a group of prisoners who sexually assaults other prisoners, most importantly their leader, known as Boggs, who has a crush on Andy. Although other prisoners consider Andy a really cold fish, Red sees something in Andy and likes him from the very start. During the first 2 years of his incarceration, Andy spends most of his time working in the prison laundry or fighting off Boggs and the Sisters. Though he persistently resists and fights them every time, Andy is beaten and sexually abused on a regular basis, but he still keeps quiet about it. When a work detail for touring the roof of one of the prison's buildings is announced, Red pulls some strings to get Andy and a few of their mutual friends assigned to the job, giving everyone a break from the usual works. During the job, Andy overhears Officer Hadley complaining about having to pay taxes for an upcoming inheritance. Drawing from his expertise as a banker, Andy lets Hadley know how he can shelter his money from the IRS by turning it into a one-time gift for his wife. He then offers to assist Officer Hadley in filling out the paperwork in exchange for some cold beers for his fellow inmates while on the touring job. Hadley first threatens to throw Andy off the roof, but eventually agrees to provide the working inmates with cold beers before the job is finished. Red remarks that Andy may have done it simply to just feel normal again. While watching a movie, Andy approaches Red with another unusual demand and asks for the actress Rita Hayworth. Red is surprised by the demand, but agrees to place the order. As he leaves the theater, Andy once more encounters the Sisters. Although he is able to talk his way out of being sexually assaulted, he is brutally beaten within an inch of his life, putting him in the infirmary for a month. Boggs spends a whole week in the solitary for the beating. When he comes out, he finds Officer Hadley and his men waiting in his cell. They beat him so badly that he is left unable to walk or eat for the rest of his life and is transferred to a prison hospital upstate. The Sisters move on and never bother Andy again. When Andy gets out of the infirmary, he finds a bunch of rocks for him to sculpt and a giant poster of Rita Hayworth in his cell, just a few presents from Red and his friends. Warden Samuel Norton hears about how Andy helped Hadley and uses a surprise cell inspection to size Andy up. He finds Andy reading his copy of the Holy Bible, and they talk about their favorite verses, while the guards are turning the cell upside down looking for illegal possessions. Satisfied with their encounter, the warden leaves and almost forget to give Andy his Bible back. He then encourages Andy to keep reading the Bible, saying that salvation lays within. Andy is later advised that he will now work in the prison library with aging inmate Brooks Hatton. The reason for his transfer is made obvious when a prison guard shows up asking Andy for financial advising. Andy sets up a makeshift desk and starts working, providing financial advising to most prison guards and helping them with their income tax returns. Andy also sees an opportunity to expand the prison library and starts by asking the state senate for funds. He writes them letters every week. His financial support practice is so appreciated that even guards from other prisons, when they visit for inter-prison baseball matches, seek Andy's financial expertise. Even the warden himself has Andy preparing his tax returns. Andy also uses Red as an assistant. Not long afterwards, Brooks snaps and threatens to kill Haywood in order to avoid being paroled. Andy is fortunately able to talk him down. When his friends discuss Brooks' behavior, Red sympathizes with Brooks, having obviously become institutionalized after spending 50 years at Shawshank. He has become essentially conditioned to being a prisoner for the rest of his life and is unable to adapt to the outside world. Red jokingly remarks, "These walls are funny. First you hate him, then you get used to him. Enough time passes, you get so you depend on them." Brooks is paroled and goes to live in a halfway house. He is also given a job at a supermarket, which he hates. Finding it impossible to adjust to life outside the prison, he eventually commits suicide, leaving the message, "Brooks was here," carved on a wooden beam. After 6 years of writing letters, Andy receives $200 from the state for the library along with a collection of old books and phonograph records. Though the state Senate thinks this will be enough to get Andy to halt his letter-writing campaign, he is undaunted and redoubles his effort of writing to 2 letters a week. When the donations of old books and records arrive at the warden's office, Andy finds a copy of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro among the records. He locks the guard assigned to the warden's office in the bathroom and plays the record over the prison's PA system. The entire prison is soon captivated by the music. Red remarks that the voices of these women made everyone feel free, if only for a brief moment. Outside the office, Norton appears furious at the act of Andy, but Andy responds by turning up the volume. The warden orders Hadley to break into the office, and Andy is sent immediately to the solitary confinement for 2 whole weeks. When he gets out, he tells his friends that the stretch was the easiest time he ever did in the hole because he spent it with Mozart's Figaro stuck in his head for comfort. When the other prisoners tell him how unlikely that is, he talks about the power that hope can have in prison and that hope can sustain them. Red strongly disagrees with Andy, claiming that hope is a dangerous thing in a place like Shawshank and tells Andy he should get used to living without it. Andy implies that this is exactly what Brooks did, and Red leaves the table angry. Not long after, Red has a new parole hearing and realizes he's been in prison for 30 years now. He uses the exact same words he used 10 years earlier, only with no enthusiasm at all. His parole is rejected again. Andy gives him a harmonica to commemorate his 30 years, which Red replies by offering Andy a giant poster of Marilyn Monroe to commemorate his 10 years. About 4 years after the Mozart incident, the state Senate finally comes to the conclusion that they won't get rid of Andy with just another check. So, they allow him a budget of $500 a year to build his library. Andy uses it wisely and makes deals with book clubs and charities to create the best prison library in the state and names it after Brooks. With the enlarged library and more materials, Andy begins to mentor inmates who want to receive their high school diplomas so they can get a decent job once they're out. Meanwhile, Warden Norton profits from Andy's knowledge and devises a scheme where he puts prison inmates to work on public projects, which he wins by outbidding other contractors, since prisoners are cheap labor. Occasionally, he allows other contractors to score projects as long as the bribe is good enough. Andy shares the details with Red that he launders the illegal money by setting up several accounts in several banks, along with several investments, using the fake identity of Randall Stephens, a man who only exists on papers, created by Andy himself through his knowledge of the system and mail-ordered forms. Randall Stephens officially has a birth certificate, social security number, and a driver's license. Should anyone ever investigate about the scheme, they will chase a man who only exists on papers. He also jokingly notes that he was an honest man outside, but he had to go to prison to learn how to be a crook. In 1965, a young prisoner named Tommy comes to Shawshank to serve time for breaking and entering. Tommy is easygoing, charismatic, and popular among the other inmates, and is befriended by both Andy and Red. When Tommy explains that he's been going in and out of prison ever since he was 13 years old, Andy advises that Tommy should consider another line of work besides theft because he seems to not be so good at it. The suggestion really gets to Tommy and asks Andy to help him work on his high school diploma. Andy starts from teaching him English alphabets to high school lessons. Though Tommy is a really good student, he is still frustrated when he takes the exam and throws away his test paper in the trash. Andy retrieves it and sends it in anyway. Tommy asks Red about Andy's case, which Red slowly explains. Upon hearing the story, Tommy is visibly upset. He then tells Andy and Red the story of a former cellmate from another prison who boasted about killing a man who was a pro golfer at the country club he worked at, along with his lover. The woman's husband, a banker, had gone to prison for those murders. With this new information, Andy, full of hope, meets the warden, explaining Norton to help him get a new trial with Tommy as a witness. The reaction from Norton is completely contrary to what Andy had hoped for. When Andy says that he would never reveal the money laundering schemes he set up for Norton, the warden becomes furious and orders him to solitary for a whole month. The inmates discuss the sentence, mentioning it is the longest time in solitary that they've ever heard of. They also realize that Andy may truly be innocent after all and has spent almost 20 years in prison for a crime he never committed. Tommy receives a letter from the Board of Education announcing that he has passed the exam and now owns a high school diploma. A guard passes the news to Andy in his solitary cell, which makes him smile a little. Later on, Tommy is escorted outside at night to have a private meeting with the warden. Warden Norton asks him if the story he told Andy is true and if he would be willing to testify on Andy's behalf. Tommy enthusiastically agrees. The warden smiles at him before nodding to Hadley to shoot him dead. When the warden visits Andy in solitary, he tells him that Tommy tried to escape and that Hadley had no choice but to shoot him. Andy doesn't buy that story and tells Norton that everything stops and that he's not going to work for him anymore. The warden threatens Andy to shut down the library, burn all the books, and move Andy to a much different cell in a much different part of the prison, with the most hardened criminals should he stop working for him. He then leaves and orders Andy to another month in solitary to think about things. When Andy finally comes out of solitary, he and Red have a conversation where Andy talks about his wife and how much he loved her and feels responsible for her death even though he didn't pull the trigger. He talks about Juataneo, a beach town on the coast of Mexico where he'd like to live for the rest of his life and probably manage a hotel there. He then asks Red if he'd join him, to which Red says no and that he believes he is too far gone like Brooks. He then criticizes Andy for allowing Hope to mess with his mind and that it only will destroy him. Before Andy leaves, he asks Red if he knows the Buxton area. He then tells Red about a very specific hayfield where there is a large oak tree at the end of a stone wall. He then asks Red to promise him that, should he ever get paroled, he will seek that oak tree and retrieve something that was hidden among the stones but refuses to say what it is. Red promises but is worried about his friend's state of mind. His worries are heightened further when he learns that Andy has asked Haywood for a 6-foot rope. Red believes that Andy may have finally reached his breaking point and is about to commit suicide. Meanwhile, Norton asks Andy to shine his shoes for him and put his suit in for dry cleaning before retiring for the night. Andy returns to his cell and the guards turn the light off for the night. Red remarks that it was the longest night of his life. The following morning, Andy has not answered the morning call and is not standing in front of his cell like every morning. The guard yells at Andy for putting him late and walks to his cell furiously. At the same time, Norton becomes alarmed when he finds Andy's shoes in his shoebox instead of his own. The alarm goes off, announcing a missing inmate. Norton rushes to Andy's empty cell and demands an explanation. Hadley brings in Red, but Red insists that he knows nothing of Andy's plans. Becoming increasingly hostile and paranoid, Norton starts throwing Andy's sculpted rocks around the cell. When he throws one at Andy's poster of Raquel Welch, the rock punches through and into the wall. Norton tears the poster from the wall, revealing a tunnel just wide enough for a man to crawl into. It is revealed in a series of flashback sequences narrated by Red that many years ago, not long after receiving his rock hammer, Andy innocently tries to carve his name on his cell wall when a chunk of it came off. Andy, being a fan of geology, realized that the material the wall was made could make it possible for him to dig a hole in case he ever needed to escape. Andy first ordered the giant poster of Rita Hayworth to hide the hole. He then spent years digging at night with his rock hammer and hiding the dirt from his job into his pockets, which he would then empty in the courtyard during his morning walks. When Tommy was killed, Andy decided it was time to go. During the previous night's thunderstorm, Andy wore Norton's clothes underneath his own to his cell, without anyone noticing him wearing Norton's shiny shoes on his feet, including Red. He packed many of his belongings, some papers, and Norton's clothes into a plastic bag, which he tied to himself with the rope he asked for, and escaped through his hole. The tunnel he excavated led him to a space between two walls of the prison, where he found a sewer main line. Using a rock, he hit the sewer line several times with lightning strikes, and eventually broke it open. Andy crawled through 500 yards of the stinking raw sewage contained in the pipe and emerged in a brook outside the walls. Andy raises his arms in happiness and finally feels freedom after 2 decades. A search team later found his prison clothes, a bar of soap, and a very worn-out rock hammer. While the Warden and Red are discovering Andy's genius escape, Andy walks into the Maine National Bank in Portland where he had put Norton's money. Using his assumed identity as Randall Stephens and with all the necessary documentation, he closes the account and walks out with a cashier's check. Before he leaves, he asks them to drop a package in the mail. He continues his visitations to nearly a dozen other local banks, ending up with some $370,000. The package contains Warden Norton's accounting books, which are delivered straight to the Portland Daily Bugle newspaper, along with Andy's written confessions and testimony. Not long after, the Maine State Police storm Shawshank Prison along with several reporters to cover the developing story. Hadley is arrested for the murder of Tommy and is taken away by the state police. Warden Norton finally opens his safe in his office, which he hadn't touched since Andy escaped, and instead of his books, he finds the Bible he had given Andy with a note to the warden saying that he was right. Salvation did lay within. Norton then opens the book and finds that the pages had all been cut out in the shape of Andy's rock hammer. Seeing Hadley being taken away in a police squad car and the local district attorney entering the prison with several policemen holding a warrant for Norton's arrest, Norton walks back to his desk as the police pound on his door. He takes out a small revolver and commits suicide by shooting himself in the head. Red remarks that he wondered if the warden thought, right before pulling the trigger, how Andy could have ever gotten the best of him. Shortly after, Red receives a postcard from Fort Hancock, Texas, with nothing written on it. Red takes it as a sign that Andy made it into Mexico to freedom. Red and his buddies kill time talking about Andy, but Red falls into sort of a depression from missing his friend. At Red's next parole hearing in 1967, he talks to the parole board about how rehabilitated is just a made-up word invented to justify their job. He then explains how much he regrets his actions of the past, not because he's in jail, but because he knows how wrong it was. He then closes by saying that he has to live with that for the rest of his life and asks the board to stop wasting his time and leave him alone. His parole is finally granted. As a free man, he goes to live and work at the same places that Brooks did, even seeing Brooks' message carved on the wooden beam. He frequently walks by a pawn shop which has several guns to the window. At times, he contemplates trying to get back into prison, feeling that he has no life left outside the prison. But then he remembers the promise he made to Andy. Red follows Andy's instructions, hitchhiking to Buxton and finding the stone wall Andy described. Just as Andy said, there is a large black stone. Underneath is a small box containing a large sum of cash and instructions to come find him in Juataneo, although he doesn't name the city just in case. He also says he needs somebody who can get things for a project of his. Red suddenly understands all the power of hope and feels exhilarated by the feelings inside of him. After carving a new message in the wooden beam which reads, "Brooks was here, so was Red." Red violates parole and leaves the halfway house, unconcerned since no one is likely to do an extensive manhunt for an old crook like him. Red takes a bus to Fort Hancock where he crosses into Mexico. Red spots Andy and the two friends are finally reunited on a beach of the Pacific Ocean, just like Andy had been hoping for. And the story ends there.